Mr. Speaker, the Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition said it best when he said, "Never before in Canadian history has a government spent so much to achieve so little." As a Member of Parliament, it is my honour and privilege to serve the people of Perth Wellington and to represent their views in this place. So when I rise in this chamber to speak, I like to do so with them in mind. And I think of the seniors in my riding, the seniors who have worked hard all their lives and are now approaching their golden years and who are looking forward to their retirement. And they're concerned, and they've got concerns because this government has left them without a minister responsible for seniors. They're concerned because the cost of living is going up and is sure to go up even higher with a carbon tax on everything. Mr. Speaker, I think of families. I think of mums and dads in my riding who work hard, who put in extra hours so they can keep gas in the car, so they can pay their mortgage or pay their rent, so that maybe they can put their kids in a sporting activity or sign them up for piano lessons or for art class, or maybe take a day off and go on a short family vacation with their kids. I think of those families who are working hard every day but are not being listened to by this Liberal government. I think of young people, people of my generation and younger, who are graduating from university, who are starting their first real job, who are trying to pay off their student loans and maybe put a few dollars away for that first down payment to buy their first home. But yet, we have new rules and new regulations constantly coming out from the Liberal government that makes it harder and harder for those young people to get into that first home. And especially in Perth Wellington, where agriculture is the biggest driver of our local economy, I think of farmers, I think of farm families who quite literally feed the world. And yet, from this government, we see nothing. And in fact, it's even worse than that, Mr. Speaker. We see a government that has, for the past number of months, over last summer, with their proposed changes to corporate taxation measures, labeled farmers and farm families as tax cheats. I think of those people. I think of seniors. I think of families. I think of young people. I think of farmers and farm families. And, Mr. Speaker, this budget fails them. In the short time that I have on offer today, I'd like to touch on 4 key points: the debt and the deficit, infrastructure, issues related to agriculture, and, of course, taxation. For the 3rd consecutive budget, this Liberal finance minister has blown past their $10 billion projections that they promised in their election campaign. They promised 3 years of teeny tiny deficits and then a return to balance by 2019. This year, of course, we see an $18.1 billion deficit. Next year, $17.5 billion. And the government's own finance department projects that the government will not return to balanced budgets until 2045. And what's worse, Mr. Speaker, is that there's not even a plan to return to balanced budgets. When the government is asked in this place and in committee of when they'll return to balanced budgets, there's no answer. There's no even acknowledgement of the question. So this leads to 2 logical conclusions. Either they simply don't know, which is entirely possible with this Liberal government, or they do know and they're keeping it from Canadians. But, Mr. Speaker, Canadians deserve to know, because this affects their lives. This affects how they raise their families, how they invest in their businesses, how they expand the economy. And, Mr. Speaker, Conservatives don't just believe in balanced budgets because we like the concept of it. We understand that if you do not take care of our own fiscal house, we cannot invest in the priorities of Canadians. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, in the next number of years, the financing of the national debt will increase by $8.7 billion. So by 2022-2023, that's 8.7 more billions of dollars that will not go to help families. It will not go to help infrastructure investments in our rural and small town communities. It's not going to be transferred in healthcare transfers, and it will not go into public safety measures. Rather, that is $8.7 billion that will go to international financiers rather than being invested in the Canadian economy and in Canadians. Which leads me to the next point that I'd like to highlight, and that is the importance of infrastructure investment. I just mentioned the $30 billion over 3 years, $10 billion per year that the government promised their deficits would be. And in exchange for these small deficits, they would increase infrastructure funding. But here we see the government delaying their infrastructure funds to future years, and yet we're still seeing massive overrun deficits. In fact, the budget forecasts that $2.2 billion in infrastructure funding will be pushed back past 2019, and $2.4 billion, an additional $2.4 billion, will be pushed back past 2023. And it's not just Conservatives who are raising alarm on this. It's the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the same position that the Liberals used to always highlight when they were in opposition. But in his most recent report, the PBO said this, quote, Budget 2018 provides an incomplete account of the changes to the government's $186.7 billion infrastructure spending plan. PBO requested the new plan, but it does not exist. He goes on to say roughly 1/4 of the funding allocated for infrastructure from 2016-17 to 2018-19 will lapse. Both legacy and new infrastructure programs are prone to large lapses. Mr. Speaker, how can you spend $180 billion on infrastructure without a plan? Now, certainly when it comes to Liberals, they might try, but Canadians know better. And when I look at my rural communities, when I look at the towns and the small towns and cities in Perth, Wellington, I see infrastructure projects that would have a meaningful impact on the local economy being looked over. I see important projects like roads and bridges, water and wastewater. I have communities who have development freezes on because they do not have the wastewater capacities to expand. And yet we see delay after delay after delay from these Liberals when it comes to infrastructure funding. Mr. Speaker, this type of delay is unacceptable, but it's because the Liberals don't have a plan. When you have no plan, you will fail, and that's exactly what we're seeing with these Liberals. I want to touch on agriculture, because agriculture is the economic driver of our communities. And yet, in this budget, it warranted barely even a mention. Our rural communities, barely a mention. Our farm families, barely a mention. Yet the farmers and the farm families I talk to have concerns. They have concerns about the future of NAFTA, yet no plan from the Liberals. They're concerned about the added regulatory burden, yet more and more regulation being layered on them by these Liberals. They're worried about the impact of carbon pricing, of carbon taxes, yet the Liberals are going full speed ahead. And they're worried about things like the Canada Food Guide changes that could diminish dairy and red meat as part of the food guide. And they're worried about the negative impact that front-of-pack labeling could have on healthy food choices like yogurt, for example, Mr. Speaker. These are the concerns that I'm hearing from the people of my riding, which of course brings us to taxes. We have tax after tax after tax from these Liberals. We have the carbon tax, which will in effect amount to a tax on anything, on everything. Anything that is transported by road will have a tax on it, whether it's food to goods and services. It will be taxed by these Liberals and their taxes. And of course, in the last year's budget, we saw the excise tax on alcohol with a permanent escalator tax, meaning that in perpetuity, taxes will be raised on these products year after year after year automatically without the approval of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, this is simply wrong. Mr. Speaker, this budget fails. This budget fails Canadians. And it fails to restrain deficits. It fails to invest in rural infrastructure. It fails Canadians. It fails in its lack of transparency. Mr. Speaker, this budget is not good for Canadians. It will hurt Canadians and will hurt those the hardest in a lot of rural communities like those in Perth Wellington.